Hey folks, Catherine here from Research Rockstar. Thanks for joining me here today. And today we're going to talk about questionnaires. So one of the things I'd like to talk about with questionnaires today is the issue of whether or not we are always putting the best types of content into our questionnaires. More specifically, do you think that market researchers over-rely on 5-point rating scales? If you think about the last few questionnaires you've seen, or maybe if you do create your own questionnaires, do you tend to see they are pretty much full of 5-point rating scales? It does become sort of this ubiquitous default, it seems to me. I see a lot of questionnaires that are really just full of 5-point rating scales. Now, rating scales can be a very efficient way of capturing customer attitudes and self-reported behaviors. So I'm not saying we should never be using rating scales, whether they're 5 points or 7 points or 11 points. However, I do see that we tend to over-rely on rating scales, especially 5-point rating scales. So let's talk about two of the big issues with rating scales so that we can make sure that as we're creating our own questionnaires that we try to mitigate some of the known risks. Now, part of the reason why they're so comfortable for us is frankly just history. Rating scales have been around for a long time. Rating scales, and we often do use the language a little bit loosely. Sometimes people refer to rating scales, and sometimes they refer to Likert scales. And people have a tendency to use those terms interchangeably. Now, if I'm going to be academic about it, not all rating scales are Likert scales, but a lot of us do use the language sort of interchangeably. A little bit of trivia here for you. The actual pronunciation is Likert. So the gentleman who invented the Likert scale was Rensis Likert. He was a very well-known sociologist. He was actually a real expert in not only sociology, but in business management. He worked for big companies, consulting companies. He worked for the US government. And he actually developed his scale approach as a way to improve on how we do capture people's attitudes using survey research. So he wasn't doing, say, marketing research, if you will. He was looking at general population attitudes. He was looking to understand, for example, just how the population of the United States felt about or had attitudes related to war efforts and propaganda and other sorts of things. So he developed he developed the scale approach, not knowing that it would become such a favorite in the world of business and marketing going forward. And really, it ended up becoming sort of the default then. So in the 30s and 40s, a lot of sociologists were using the Likert scale. And when marketing became more sophisticated, like in the 50s and 60s, and started doing more with questionnaires, then the marketing field kind of adopted a lot of those best practices that really came from the sociology field. And so Likert scales ended up being used to commonly capture things like agreement or satisfaction or likelihood or importance. So if we think about the case of agreement, you will routinely see scales that are a 5-point scale where you're giving people some statements and you're asking to what degree do they agree with these different statements. And the scale might be labeled somewhere from disagree strongly to agree strongly, right? So that might be one way of labeling the endpoints on an agreement scale. So very often we do see them as 5-point scales, but again, rating scales can come in a lot of different sizes and also, of course, can be either even or odd. So why do I have a problem with rating scales? Again, I think they can be useful. I do think we tend to default to them when they're not necessarily the best option. There are other types of scales that we can use in questionnaires that are not rating scales. So here's the first example of why rating scales are somewhat of a challenge. If you go onto Amazon and you look at reviews, you'll see that there are a lot of reviews, right? A lot of products have many, many reviews, and the reviews are actually using not a Likert scale, but a graphical rating scale, the 5-star system. And that's something that we're very, very used to. So instead of using the labels on a written scale, you're using the 5 stars as your rating scale. But when you look at Amazon reviews for any given product, look at what the specific rating was in terms of stars, and then look at the words, what the person actually wrote. So in my example, I was looking at a robotic puppy product, and I get some cases where they are getting 5 points or five stars, excuse me. So 5 stars, great toy. 5 stars, hooray. Um, then you get awesome Christmas gift, 4 stars. And when you read the text, the person who wrote the 4-star review and called it awesome Christmas gift seems just as enthusiastic as the person who gave 5 stars. So why didn't they give 5 stars? Why is that 4 stars? It's because it's subjective. It's a very subjective scale. What I consider to be 4 stars might not be what you consider to be 4 stars. So some people are very, very kind of stingy, if you will, in terms of giving out 5 stars. Other people give out 5 stars readily. So you can see that there can be some inconsistencies in how people use rating scales. Another one from the example that I was looking up was somebody said, "This is the worst gift. High level of difficulty." They even raised the question of whether or not the item is defective, yet they gave it 3 stars. So you would read the words and think this is definitely a 1-star review, but it was actually a 3-star review. So people can really give out their stars very, very inconsistently. So the fact that people use the star system differently presents some challenges for those of us who actually want to do quantitative data analysis. How do I analyze data on a scale that's being used in a very, very inconsistent way? We have to be really careful about it. Rating scales are ordinal data, right? They're not interval data, they're ordinal data. And that has implications for what kinds of data analysis that we can do. Let's take another look at the issue of rating scales. If we look at a rating scale of satisfaction, you might have a 5-point satisfaction scale that gets labeled from not at all satisfied, slightly satisfied, somewhat satisfied, very satisfied, or completely satisfied. That's what we would call an example of a unipolar rating scale. But if we think about the distance, if you will, between any of those points, my definition of not at all satisfied versus slightly satisfied could definitely be different than yours, right? I might be very inclined to give a slightly satisfied, even if I really don't like the product, but maybe I just don't like to give a not at all satisfied unless the product literally explodes on me, right? I might have a very, very high bar for what I have to have experienced in order to say not at all satisfied. What about the difference between somewhat satisfied and very satisfied? Again, some people are going to give out the very satisfied a lot more easily, and other people are going to be more likely to stay around somewhat satisfied. You're really going to have to thrill them quite a bit to get them to move from somewhat to very satisfied. Again, because we don't know that people are using these scales consistently, we don't know the distance, if you will, between the points, it limits what we can do with the data analysis. And again, that's why we would never, for example, calculate means, or we shouldn't be calculating means based on Likert scale data. So we do have some challenges with rating scales. So again, they can be used. They can be very efficient in certain situations, but I do think people tend to over-rely on them. And unfortunately, I see people using them to calculate means and do other things with statistics that they really shouldn't be doing, if we're trying to be accurate in how we're doing our quantitative data analysis. The other issue that's coming up with rating scales these days is people are getting a little too creative. Now, I get it. You are trying to get people to take your survey, right? You send out a questionnaire and you don't want it to be boring. I get that. I get that sometimes we have to be a little creative in order to engage people. There are a lot of people out there who have been over surveyed. They are just not interested in responding to your invitation to please complete your short questionnaire. So maybe you start playing around with the labels a bit to try to make it more interesting. Well, I have seen some really crazy labels lately, like instead of a standard not at all satisfied to completely satisfied, people doing things like makes me want to run away to makes me want to fall in love, right? So people are getting very creative to try to engage the participants. Now, I applaud the interest in being creative, but there's a challenge with that. When you start playing around with different ways of labeling the points on your scale, you don't know whether or not your population is interpreting those phrases consistently or not. Now, as I've just established, rating scales are very subjective as it is. Now you start throwing out all of these really creative word choices to label the rating scale, and you're really creating a very dicey situation in terms of how are you going to interpret that data. It turns out that rating scales and how we label them are extremely well researched. Our goal is replicability. I need to make sure that everybody who's taking my survey, everybody who's participating in the survey project, is interpreting my scale consistently. And that's why a lot of professional researchers do stick to pretty traditional satisfaction, importance, agreements, likelihood types of labels, because the wacky stuff is fun, but tends to get interpreted really differently by different people. If everybody who's seeing my questionnaire is interpreting those fun new labels differently, then I've got a problem when I'm trying to when I'm trying to analyze my data. How do I analyze data if I don't have confidence that people are consistently interpreting my scale? So in professional research, we don't wing it when it comes to labeling the points of our rating scales. Proper scales are actually tested. We do research to make sure that they are going to provide replicable results, right? That we know that they are going to be interpreted reasonably consistently, right? There's always going to be some outliers, but in general, people will consistently interpret them in a way that I'm going to be confident that I can do my data analysis. And poorly worded scales really do lead to poor data. We have to make sure that we're using scales that are tested. So a lot of the scales that you see from professional researchers are scales that actually are tested and that are known. Now, if you're newer to research or you work someplace where they haven't given you sort of like some standards on these are the scales we know work and therefore you should be using them, there are a couple of great resources that you can use. So one of my favorite books is the Handbook of Marketing Scales. This book has hundreds of scales in it that have been tested. So a lot of the work is done at universities. You'll see a lot of notes in here from professors about how they tested to make sure that the results were consistent from these different scales. And they've got scales on everything related to customer attitudes, employee attitudes, attitudes about the environment, attitudes about new products. They've got tons of different categories. And with the scales, they also share the results about the validity of that scale so that you know that you can use that scale with confidence. Another great resource, there's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Gordon Bruner, who is a university professor at the Southern Illinois University, and he has this wonderful website called Marketing Scales. He actually was the co-author of another scales book that is also excellent, but he really keeps the research alive. He's continuously adding new scales and new research about scales on the website Marketing Scales. And so the wonderful thing about the work that he does is that he is really working to take scales that are being developed and tested by a lot of different academics and practitioners so that there's a single place where you can go look for scales by specific topic. Like, what are you trying to measure? Are you trying to measure maybe customer loyalty attitudes? Great. So you could go to the Marketing Scales website and you could say, okay, I want to see all the scales related to this. And not only do you get the scales, but you get Professor Bruner's research about the validity of those scales. So really a great resource that I highly recommend. So hopefully I haven't scared you off of rating scales, but just so we all understand, rating scales are very subjective. There are other types of scales out there, and we absolutely, if you're using them, please don't wing it on how you're labeling them unless you really are just using the data in a very anecdotal way and you're not really going to be doing any robust data analysis. By the way, if you are interested in questionnaire design and making sure you're following best practices for questionnaire design as a professional researcher, one of the courses we have at Research Rockstar is Questionnaire Design 201, which is all about scale selection. So especially for folks who may feel like, gosh, I didn't know there were other types of scales. This is one of the resources you can use to learn about all sorts of scales, not just rating scales, although we certainly cover those as well. So that is a course that meets once a week for 4 weeks. And you can find out more about that at training.researchrockstar.com. If you have any questions about the topic of scales, please post them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this YouTube video or the associated iTunes podcast, please do like it and subscribe. The more likes and subscriptions I see, the more I'll continue doing this. Thanks again and have a great day.